Hey everyone, welcome back to Espresso English, your go-to podcast for diving deep into the English language. I'm David, and I'm here with Landa.
Hi everyone, we've got a special episode for you today, where we're going to break down some of the most important and versatile verbs in English. These are verbs you probably use all the time, but there's a lot more to them than meets the eye.
That's right, Landa. Today, we're focusing on 10 key verbs: adapt, admire, admit, accept, acknowledge, adopt, advise, agree, allow, and analyze. Not only are we going to explain their meanings, but we'll also cover their noun, adjective, and adverb forms. Plus, we'll throw in some common idioms and give real-world examples to show you how to use them like a native speaker.
Yeah, and we'll also be throwing in some examples where one of us explains and the other adds to it, so it'll feel like a real conversation, kind of like you'd experience in a natural classroom setting. So, let's get started with our first verb, adapt.
Okay, so adapt. This is one of those verbs that's all about change. We use adapt when something or someone has to adjust to a new situation. You can adapt to a new culture, adapt to a new job, or even adapt a book into a movie.
Yes, adapt is incredibly versatile. It's commonly used when talking about flexibility or how people or things change to fit a new environment or condition. For example, after moving to a new city, she quickly adapted to the different climate. It's all about that transition, isn't it?
Exactly. And let's not forget the noun form, adaptation. You've probably heard this one when talking about movies or TV shows that are based on books. The adaptation of the novel into a film was a big hit. But adaptation can also refer to how living things adjust to their environments. In biology, we talk about adaptations as changes that help animals survive, like camouflage or nocturnal vision.
Right. Then there's the adjective adaptive, which describes something or someone that can easily adjust to new conditions. Like, he's really adaptive when it comes to learning new software.
And there's also adaptable, which is similar, but more focused on a person's general ability to change. You might hear someone say, "She's very adaptable under pressure." It's a good quality to have in today's fast-paced world.
Exactly. And one idiom I love that fits well with adapt is go with the flow. This means to adapt easily to changing situations without getting stressed out. For example, if you want to enjoy the trip, just go with the flow and adapt to whatever happens.
Great idiom. And notice how adapt is always about flexibility. It's not just about making changes, but thriving in those new situations. Ready to move on to our next verb?
Sure, the next verb is admire. This one is about respect or admiration. When you admire someone, you look up to them, maybe because of their talents, their achievements, or their character. You can also admire things, like art or nature. For example, I admire her dedication to her work, or they admired the beautiful sunset.
Exactly. And when you think of admire, you should also think of admiration. That's the noun form. It's the feeling of respect or wonder we have for someone or something. He has a lot of admiration for his mentor. It's one of those words you hear often in both formal and casual conversation.
And how about admirable? That's the adjective form. We use it when we want to say that something or someone is worthy of admiration. Her courage in the face of adversity was admirable. It's a bit more formal but still widely used, especially when you want to praise someone's qualities.
And let's not forget the adverb admirably. It's not used as often, but you might hear it in sentences like, "He handled the situation admirably," meaning he dealt with it in a way that's worthy of respect.
There's also a great idiom related to admire, which is take my hat off to someone. It means you respect or admire someone's actions or achievements. For example, I take my hat off to her for completing that marathon. It's a very visual expression, almost like you're tipping your hat in recognition of someone's efforts.
Right. And it's often used in a way that feels genuine but informal. It's the kind of thing you say when you're really impressed by someone's hard work or accomplishments. All right, shall we dive into admit?
Absolutely. Admit is one of those verbs that deals with honesty and owning up to something, often something that's difficult to say. You might admit a mistake, like, I admit that I didn't study enough for the exam. Or you can admit something positive too, like, I admit that I love chocolate.
Yeah, and that's what makes admit so interesting. It's often used when you're revealing something, whether it's good or bad, and sometimes it's used to soften a statement, especially if the admission is surprising. For instance, I'll admit that I didn't expect the meeting to go so well.
Right, and the noun form here is asterisk admission asterisk. You might hear, his admission of guilt came as a shock. It's a formal way of saying someone has confessed to something. And don't forget about the adjective admissible, which is used mostly in legal contexts, like the judge ruled that the evidence was admissible in court.
Good point. Admit also shows up in a common idiom, bite the bullet, which means to face something difficult or unpleasant that you'd rather avoid. For example, I didn't want to apologize, but I had to bite the bullet and admit I was wrong.
That's a great idiom, and it perfectly captures that sense of reluctance we often associate with admit. It's all about owning up to something even when it's uncomfortable. Shall we move on to accept?
Yes, let's talk about accept. This verb is all about agreeing to take or receive something, whether that's a physical object, an idea, or even a situation. For example, she accepted the job offer, or he accepted the reality of his situation.
Exactly. And one of the most important things about accept is that it often carries a sense of embracing or coming to terms with something. For example, it took him a while to accept that things had changed. You're not just agreeing, you're also internalizing the situation.
Right. And the noun form is acceptance, like her acceptance into the university was a big deal for her family. It's about receiving something, often with approval or recognition. There's also an emotional side to it, as in acceptance of loss, which means coming to terms with something difficult.
And don't forget the adjective acceptable. We use this to describe something that meets certain standards or is allowed. For example, is this behavior acceptable in the classroom? It's a pretty common word in both formal and informal settings.
And let's not forget the idiom, take it on the chin. This means to accept a difficult situation with resilience or without complaint. He didn't get the promotion, but he took it on the chin and kept working hard.
Exactly. And accept is all about that balance between agreeing with something and learning to live with it, especially in tough situations. All right, let's move on to acknowledge.
Okay, so acknowledge. This verb is a bit more formal, and it's all about recognizing or admitting the existence or truth of something. For example, she acknowledged that she had made a mistake, or he acknowledged the contribution of his team in the success.
Yes, and it's often used when someone has to formally admit something they might not want to. Like, the company finally acknowledged the complaints from customers. It's similar to admit, but with a more formal or public aspect.
Right. And the noun form is acknowledgement. You see this a lot in books or speeches when people give thanks. In the acknowledgements, she thanked her family and friends. It's all about giving credit where it's due.
Speaking of giving credit, we have the adjective acknowledged, as in, he is an acknowledged leader in his field, meaning everyone recognizes his expertise.
That leads perfectly into the idiom, give credit where credit is due. It means you should recognize someone's work or effort, even if you don't always agree with them. Like, we may have our differences, but I have to give credit where credit is due. He really worked hard on that project.
Yes, and that phrase really highlights how important it is to acknowledge someone's efforts, especially in professional or team settings. Let's move on to adopt next, shall we?
Sure. Adopt is a really versatile verb. The most common meaning is when you legally take a child into your family, like they adopted a child from another country. But it's also used in a broader sense, like when you adopt new habits or ideas. For example, we adopted a new approach to solving the issue.
Exactly, and that's what makes adopt such an interesting verb. It's not just about taking in children, it's also about embracing new ways of thinking or doing things. Like, the company adopted a new technology to improve efficiency.
The noun form is adoption, as in, the adoption of new policies was well received by the staff. And we also have adoptive as an adjective, which we typically use in relation to parents, like, her adoptive parents were very supportive.
Right, and here's a great idiom: pick up the torch. It means to take responsibility for something, often something started by someone else. For example, after the founder retired, his daughter picked up the torch and led the company. It's a nice metaphor for adopting a responsibility or continuing someone's legacy.
Good one. Adopt is really about taking on something new, whether it's a responsibility, a child, or even a new perspective. Ready for the next one?
Definitely. Advise is one of those verbs that's all about giving guidance or recommendations. You might advise someone on what career path to take or what they should wear to a job interview. For example, the doctor advised him to get more exercise.
Right. And the noun form is advice, which, by the way, is uncountable in English. So we say some advice instead of an advice. For example, can you give me some advice on how to improve my writing?
Exactly. And the adjective is advisable, which means something is recommended or suggested. It's advisable to wear a helmet when cycling. It's a formal way of saying that something is a good idea.
And the idiom here is give someone a piece of your mind. This means to scold or criticize someone strongly, often in the form of advice. When he broke the vase, his mom really gave him a piece of her mind.
Great example. And that idiom shows how advise can sometimes come with a bit of frustration or intensity. Shall we move on to agree?
Absolutely. So, agree is one of the most fundamental verbs in English. It's used when two or more people share the same opinion. For example, I agree with you on that point.
Yes, and the noun form is agreement, like, they reached an agreement after a long discussion. It's a formal way of saying that people have come to a consensus.
And then there's agreeable, which describes someone or something that's pleasant or willing to agree. He was very agreeable to the changes we proposed.
Exactly. And one idiom that comes to mind is be on the same page. It means to have the same understanding or opinion as someone else. We need to make sure we're all on the same page before we start the project.
That's such a useful expression, especially in business or team settings. Shall we finish up with allow and analyze?
Sure. Allow means to give permission for something or to enable it to happen. For example, she allowed him to leave early, or the system allows for multiple users.
Exactly. The noun form is allowance, which can also refer to an amount of money given regularly. For example, my parents gave me a weekly allowance. And allowable is the adjective form, which means something is permitted, like, that's not allowable under the new rules.
Right. And a great idiom here is give someone the green light, which means to give permission to go ahead with something. For example, the boss gave us the green light to start the project.
Finally, we have analyze. This verb is all about examining something in detail to understand it better. For example, the scientist analyzed the data to find patterns.
Exactly. The noun form is analysis, like, the analysis of the results took several days, and the adjective is analytical, which describes someone who is good at breaking things down to understand them better. She has an analytical mind, which makes her great at solving problems.
And don't forget the idiom, break it down. It's used informally to mean analyze or explain something step by step. Can you break down this concept for me?
Perfect. That's all for today's verbs. Hopefully, this deep dive has helped everyone understand these verbs, their forms, and how to use them in natural, everyday conversation.
Absolutely. Remember, practice is key. Try using these verbs in your daily conversations or writing, and soon they'll feel like second nature.
Thanks for tuning in to Espresso English. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth episodes on English grammar and vocabulary.
See you next time. And remember, keep practicing. and keep unlocking those words.